Welcome to True Diversification, a new era of diversification. True Diversification is an integrated investment approach consisting of 4 inventions. The inventions are for diversification optimization, diversification visualization, diversification measurement, and diversification search. All of our diversification inventions come together in our platform called G-Sphere to provide investors with true diversification. Whatever it is, to measure it, you have to manage it. That's as true in portfolio management as it is in any other discipline. Sir Isaac Newton was a quant pioneer. Not only did he discover gravity, but he is one of the first people to bring calculus to our collective consciousness. He also was the first to quantify the word force. Now, force had been used in the English language for centuries before Newton figured out how to measure it. And in doing so, he unlocked a whole new realm of applications for engineering sciences and physics. The diversification techniques invented by James Schroeder to measure diversification may have a similar impact on portfolio management and on how successful your portfolio's investments are, which is something that most investors, whether professional or retail, do have an intuition about, but they've never really been able to quantify it. Certain techniques do exist for quantifying diversification, such as correlations or R-squareds or betas. And apart from that, when we look at a portfolio and its contents, we have really been limited to looking at things like asset quantity. And that's a very insufficient mechanism for measuring diversification. About a decade ago, James championed the first methodology for a holistic diversification measurement, and that was called the IPC, or intra-portfolio correlation. The IPC is a very good litmus test for how diversified a portfolio is, and it helps to gauge that portfolio's diversification against systemic influences. The higher the number, the better. Generally, these numbers top out at about 60%, and there are very profound implications between your diversification level and the portfolio's ability to protect capital. This number is well complemented by the concentration coefficient for equally weighted equivalents, which was developed at the Brandeis Institute in San Diego. This is a better measure than counting the assets. Each of these measures helps to understand diversification. But how do you account for both systemic and non-systemic diversification? The industry needed a single framework and measure to account for diversification. And that is a number represented by the portfolio's dimensionality. When we talk about dimensionality and measuring diversification, let's separate a little bit of fact from fiction here about what it is and what it isn't. What it is not is a number of investments that you own. It is not the performance relative to anything else. Again, as owners of portfolios, we're only interested in what is happening inside our portfolio. And it is not the benefit of some diversification on other metrics. True diversification is the optimal combination of the number of investments, the uniqueness of each of those investments, and the right weighting of those investments, based principally on helping the portfolio improve diversification. Historically, diversification has been achieved using Dr. Harry Markowitz's mean variance optimization. But this is not measuring diversification for the sake of diversification, but using diversification for the sake of lowering volatility. If your objective is lowering volatility, then this is an efficient approach. After such an optimization, we know we have efficient diversification, but we don't know how much we have. It is likely we've only achieved a superficial sense of diversification. Diversification must be measured to know the difference. The analogy is that superficial diversification looks like a two-dimensional teeter-totter and subjects the portfolio to potentially a single pivot point or balancing point. This balancing point subjects the portfolio to estimation risk should that single correlation fail. Many variables must be held constant in the superficial teeter-totter to have that delicate sense of balance maintained. In the world of investments, just as in the teeter-totter, it can be all too easy to get out of balance. Extending diversification from a two-dimensional intuition to a multi-dimensional quantification is very important. This is one of our diversification visualization images, and here we represent the diversification as a three-dimensional balance or symmetry. So we try to fill up a sphere in perfect balance in 3D, and the extent to which that portfolio has succeeded in doing that shows more and more diversification. And you should investigate our diversification visualization methodologies, but that is another chapter. So the key essence here is we're talking about a multidimensional balance, and in the case of our visualization, we're talking about 3D. but there are really no limitations as to how many dimensions we can use. And in fact, the more dimensions, the better. Essentially, the inputs of our measurement technique include all the correlation information, or any kind of form that relates how these different investments relate to one another. We combine that information with the assets and percentages held in each of those assets. All that information gets flattened down to its very essence, and that essence tells us how many dimensions does it take to represent that information. It is called an intrinsic dimension. Just a small primer on dimensions, which you might recall from grade school. The concept of one dimension and two dimensions. A line is one-dimensional. And the key concept here is for each additional dimension, here, just looking at going from the second to the third dimension, is going perpendicular or independent to what already existed here with two dimensions. And that's always going to be the case with dimensions. Every time we add a dimension, from a line to a square or a square to a cube, we're adding something which is unrelated or independent, orthogonal to what exists already. Three dimensions, very easy, very intuitive to work with. But the exact same concept still applies whether we're talking about 4D, 5D, even more dimensions. Space-time is a really good way to think about 4 dimensions, 3 physical dimensions, and 1 time dimension. But our universe is really multidimensional. String theorists believe our universe consists of 12 dimensions. Now, we don't really have the facilities and intuition behind what's happening in all those dimensions, but it doesn't mean they're not there. In mathematics, we can have any number of dimensions, and all our visualizations take a high-dimension portfolio and project it back to 3 dimensions so that we can understand it. Now, what we learn doing this is that there's some level where this portfolio should be represented that is really its intrinsic dimension. And unlocking the secret to measuring diversification was found in our projection techniques for showing these portfolios. This is a chart graphing the measurement of diversification. The diversification is the portfolio's dimensionality. Starting with the middle number in the top right, on the vertical axis, we see we're at 21 dimensions, and on the horizontal axis, we're at 100. This is 100% of the portfolio, and percent of the portfolio can be thought of in an abstract sense. So it's kind of like amount of the portfolio for probability, amount of money, amount of time, amount of data. It's sort of all of those things combined into an abstract sense. The account here at 100 suggests it takes 21 dimensions to represent all of that portfolio information with no compression, no loss of data. At 50%, we can see it takes 11 dimensions to fully contain and represent all of that information. So at 50%, the most important or rudimentary part of the portfolio here consists of investments represented in 11 dimensions. So what does this chart teach us? It teaches us 2 things. It really teaches us about how that portfolio is diversified from a systemic influence and how it's diversified from concentration issues. So its peak dimensionality on the right side of the spectrum is really more used to measure the portfolio's susceptibility to concentration issues. And we not only look at the numbers, but the steepness at which the portfolio comes up to achieve its peak number. The steeper the ascent to the portfolio's peak dimensionality, the more superficial the portfolio's peak dimensionality, and the more redundancy there is among the holdings. At the other end of the spectrum, from a systemic risk perspective, when you want to understand how your portfolio's diversification is built to withstand systemic risk, this is what we look at. How deep does this first step go? So the deeper the first step, the more exposure your portfolio is taking to systemic risk. So the first dimension is really market risk. And here at 60%, this portfolio suggests that 60% of the portfolio is dictated or confined or determined by nothing more than the ebb and flow of the market. So in general, we like to shorten this first step and introduce different investments that uniquely have the potential to go up, but don't relate to one another. When examining diversification using dimensions, we can see that there's a perfect level of dimensions for any given quantity of assets. And that occurs if and only if each of those investments are perfectly uncorrelated to one another. The more uncorrelated those investments are, the smaller the presences of the red space. And where we have portfolios where each of the investments are uncorrelated to each other and equally weighted, we're going to have a very consistent stairstep that will mimic this diagonal line. Therefore, you're not missing any potential diversification out of any of the investment sets that you have. Now, anybody in the investment business knows how tricky it is to find lots and lots of sources of uncorrelated investments, especially ones that have strong return potential. Please take the liberty to inquire about our diversification search technologies that allow managers to expediently and scientifically locate custom-tailored diversification ideas for your portfolio. When we want to understand diversification, this is a slide you might want to come back and reference at a future point. We look at several things. We look at how does that total dimension peak, and we want to raise the number. The higher the number, the better. We're also concerned with the path it takes to get there. We want a nice, consistent stair-step path to produce that high number. When we have that consistent stair-step, it means we have consistent sources of diversification introduced to that portfolio throughout the allocation. And we're not depending on one or two sources of diversification to provide that diversification. In fact, that's the problem with the old ways of looking at it from a superficial perspective. If you end up betting, essentially, all of your risk reduction and diversification on one source based on one correlation holding it up, well, it doesn't sound like diversification. It sounds like a big bottleneck in your diversification. So essentially, by diversifying your diversification, we end up with a process we call true diversification. And each of those independent sources then stand a better chance of holding up when things go bad. Now, we all know some of those investments are going to start to come together. But the more independent sources that we have, the more chances we have of some of those investment sources standing up and holding up against portfolio turbulence, volatility, and loss of capital. So let's look at a good portfolio versus a bad portfolio. Again, a good portfolio, here, 21 dimensions. A bad portfolio, 5 dimensions. A good portfolio, lots of nice, small, consistent steps up to reach its total dimensions. A bad portfolio, few steps, kind of choppy, and it has a much more hyperbolic effect when it comes up at the end. A good portfolio, a small first step. It looks like we reach out of the first dimension into the second here at the third bar. And here we don't get out of this first dimension until we're at 38% of the portfolio. Making these first steps more shallow protects the portfolio from systemic risk. We hope you've learned a little bit about diversification, and we'd encourage everyone to learn more about our diversification visualization options. And those are the 3D graphics. Learn more about our diversification optimization process. Also learn why diversification matters. Then, for those of you with more of a technical disposition, including CIOs, certified financial analysts, and other quantitative investment professionals, we've produced a lot of research you might be interested in to see how diversification compares to other statistics. See how it changes over time. We can do custom research pieces for you to help you understand how your diversification measures, what kinds of sensitivities there are in that diversification score, and what kind of diversification might be potential from within your own investment group. Gravity Capital Partners makes all of our technologies available to funds, advisors, plan or platform sponsors, and other financial institutions as sub-advisory or overlay solutions. Again, thank you. You can learn more about what we're doing at gravityinvestments.com.